I can't even count the number of lawsuits that were filed against me in different places, not to mention bar actions. My own Texas bar tried for 4 years to disbar me over it. And like I said, I knew what I was saying was true. It was obvious to me.
What's happening right now? Because there's so many people who care about this. Thank God.
Yes, I know there are lots of places where citizens are trying to get hand counting of the vote passed. Dallas County was one of them, but the county kept throwing up obstacle after obstacle and saying there's this other thing you have to do, there's an additional thing you have to do, and just on and on. So apparently it's not going to happen in Dallas County this spring. I am personally convinced that until we get paper ballots that are hand marked and hand counted, any use of a machine at any stage of the process will corrupt the process or can corrupt the process. It will make it completely untrustworthy because any part of a computer program can be hacked or programmed to begin with to do something wrong. And that's what has happened all across the country for, frankly, the last 20, 24 years, ever since a computer was first used in the election. And
it sounds like common sense. So the question is, why would people be arguing against this? In other words, is it wrong to conclude that they are simply corrupt? Is it wrong to conclude that they're simply criminals who want to get away with more crime? Is there any other conclusion you can make? What is the argument?
I can't I can't find another conclusion. They say that hand counting will be more expensive, blah, 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 and not as reliable. Well, nothing can be less reliable than the machines. We have a banking system that counts down to the penny accurately, and if there's the slightest discrepancy, it's a big problem. Here we're relying on machines to do our votes and count our votes, and we know that they're being manipulated and rigged and programmed wrong. There's no doubt about it any longer. And I think with the capture of Mr. Maduro, we may have even more information. I understand
we captured Maduro?
Yeah.
What? Really?
Yeah.
I don't know what news you're reading. I haven't heard about that. Okay, so seriously, folks, with the capture of Maduro, do you think, Sidney, that part of the deal, part of the reason Trump did this, at least part of the reason, was because he believes that Maduro has the goods and will be willing to make a deal and spill the beans on Venezuela being, the beating heart of corruption in terms of votes around the world and specifically in this country?
Venezuela has been the site of innumerable efforts by other countries to work with Venezuela to destroy us. Iran was building drones there. Of course, Maduro was selling oil to our enemies. That's part of why we had to go in and get him. But I think all of it is wrapped up into one huge ball of corruption that includes elections that they spread internationally and corrupted. Gary Bernstein is a former CIA agent who he's been working on this for the last 5 years nonstop, I think. And he has managed to get some Venezuelan whistleblowers and Smartmatic whistleblowers to come forward and tell him everything. There's a fascinating interview with him on Laura Logan's X feed that is excellent, and he explains it all. It's essentially most of the things that I said back in 2020. And now he's got witnesses from inside Smartmatic to help prove it. So this should all come to a head. I mean, I'm hearing rumors that something big's going to happen within the next 10 days on the topic.
Well, I don't know if you can talk about this, but I cannot imagine what it's been like for you knowing these things for 5 years and waiting for 5 years for this more and more to come out. I mean, I can relate to that on the tiniest level because I knew 5 years ago that the election was stolen. I thought everybody should be up in arms. And most people were saying, oh, you better not talk about it. But I thought, how despicable, what cowards. And so you were one of the brave ones. You stuck your neck out. You talked about this. You suffered tremendously as a result of it. You have to be glad that finally, by the grace of God, this information seems to be getting out to the public.
Yeah, I am very thankful, mainly because we need to fix it. But it is nice to know that what I said was true. I knew it at the time. I firmly believed it at the time. I had nothing to indicate otherwise. All the facts were pointing in the direction of massive election fraud in 2020. But it's nice to have actual witnesses come forward and say what they knew from the inside. That's fantastic evidence, and Gary deserves great credit. He and his partner, Martine, deserve great credit for digging all this up and staying on it.
Mike Lindell has been a hero, but do you believe President Trump is in the weeds on this, that he's actually aware of what's going on?
I would think he would be. He's certainly been interested in it since 2020. He really wanted to do something back then, but nobody standing around him in any official capacity would help him do it or even tell him that he could. On that infamous December 18 meeting at the White House that so much has been written about, frankly, all I did was show him an executive order that Obama had signed and a couple of other documents, including a CISA FBI finding of international election interference already, which gave him the authority to use all presidential powers to do whatever needed to be done to straighten out the election. But of course, Pat Cipollone, his White House counsel, and everybody around him was vehemently opposed to that. So here we've suffered the previous 4 years with the Autopen administration and all kinds of things going wrong. We were on the brink of the country being destroyed, but thank God we got him elected by making it too big to rig. That's the only way he got elected. And we've got to get it straightened out now, or it will never be. And everybody knows it. Everybody knows it. And I knew as soon as they started piling lawsuits on me for billions of dollars that I was right over the target. If it had just been, if what I was saying was false, they could have just blown it off. But instead, I got sued by 10 different people in different courts across the country, including for $4 billion in the District of Columbia by Smartmatic and Dominion, and by, of course, Eric Coomer in Colorado, and then somebody in Arizona, somebody in South Carolina. I mean, I can't even count the number of lawsuits that were filed against me in different places, not to mention bar actions. My own Texas bar tried for 4 years to disbar me over it. And like I said, I knew what I was saying was true. It was obvious to me.
Well, when they come after you like that, and that's the beauty of it. You realize that it's an existential threat to them. If this stuff comes out, I guess my question is, do you think anyone will pay the price? Because I really can't think of anything more wicked. I keep saying, I've been saying it for 5 years. It's like putting a bullet in the head of Lady Liberty and Uncle Sam. This is murdering America. This is murdering we the people. That's what this is. There's no hyperbole there. You end America. What Iran would like to do, what China would like to do, what the Soviet Union would have loved to do, you can do in this way. And these people have done in this way. They've attempted to do it in this way. So it's astonishing to me that people wouldn't understand the gravity of it, that it doesn't get bigger than this. This is murdering the 250-year-old republic. That's what this is. And so anybody involved in that, it seems to me, is culpable. I'm not a lawyer. I have no idea what that might mean legally. Do you have any sense legally of what this would mean, or whether anybody's going after anybody on this? Because again, these are crimes. These are crimes against the American people, against the nation.
They're the most serious crimes I could possibly think of. But yes, there are any number of criminal statutes that should or could be applied in different ways to punish those responsible for this. And that had better be done. I mean, it not only was a blow to Lady Liberty, it was a destruction of the rule of law. And the only way the rule of law can be used in this country is if we are fairly electing and cleanly electing our public officials to enforce it. And without the rule of law, we're no better than any third world country, which is exactly what they wanted to turn us into. China owns Venezuela almost. And of course, Russia has its hand in the pot too. Cuba is directly tied to Venezuela. All the communists. It was like the focal point of the communists to have things in Venezuela that could be a base even for getting into the United States. Not to mention all the gang members that Mr. Maduro sent up here to infiltrate our country.
When you mentioned that meeting in the White House, December 18th, 2020, can you talk about that? Who was there? And I wonder, you mentioned one name, I guess the White House counsel. What's the name?
Pat Cipollone.
I thought it was Ciccolino from the Marx Brothers films.
No, Cipollone.
It was not Ciccolino?
No.
It was, but I wonder whether President Trump realizes that these people sold him out.
I think he knows it now. I definitely think he does. I mean, when I showed him the executive order that gave him all this authority and the FBI findings that existed already that triggered that authority, his ability to use it, nobody told him either of those things. And this is, 6 weeks after the election.
Are you at liberty to say who some of these folks are? You just mentioned that lawyer. Are you at liberty to mention the others who strongly advised him to leave this alone, that he didn't have the authority?
There was another White House counsel there, like a deputy, who was getting ready to leave already. I can't remember his name. Rudy was there. I'm not sure what he wanted. It wasn't clear what outcome he wanted from that. He, of course, thought the legislative process would help resolve the problem, but it didn't. And I'm trying to remember. There were several other people. Eric Hirschman, I think his name was, who had some role in the White House. I'm not sure what that was.
I guess my sense, correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm very happy to be wrong or to be corrected, but it was my sense that there were people around Trump, the kind of people that we would now say are part of the uniparty, part of the establishment, who they're made uncomfortable by figures such as yourself, Rudolph Giuliani, Jenna Ellis. They're made uncomfortable by some of the folks that really are warriors for liberty. These aren't the kind of people, these are mainstream figures that they'd rather look the other way while liberty and the rule of law is being murdered than be written about unpleasantly in the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or the Washington Post. And so it was my sense at the time that you and Rudy that you were pushed out, that you were kind of characterized as you're fringe, you're kind of, you're a little crazy, and we're going to go with
they flat out called me crazy. Yeah, I heard that word a lot.
But so who are the figures in this? I mean, I can't help but think that Mike Pence is one of those figures.
Well, he was not in that meeting, but obviously he didn't think the election was stolen. What really disturbs me is hearing that Susie Wiles didn't think the election was stolen and thought those of us that were saying that were crazy. That is something I read in a newspaper, I believe. So I don't
Sidney,
know if that's true.
Just before we go on, and I want you to continue on this line, but I want to be clear. Ladies and gentlemen, it is possible for people to be wrong and to realize that they were wrong. In other words, there were people, I know people that were wrong on these issues and other issues. They were wrong on the COVID vaccine. They were wrong on all kinds of stuff, who eventually realized I was wrong. So that is always the hope, that somebody like a Susie Wiles would have realized eventually I was wrong. I was suckered, because and I know that the mainstream conservative media, Fox News, they were not, ringing the bell here and saying, hey, it looks like the election was stolen. They were very happy, to march along. And, I just can't think of anything uglier in modern American history than that. I do think that over the last 5 years, some of these folks realized that they were wrong. At least that's my hope, as I say.
Well, the 2024 election was a stunning contrast to the 2020 election. I mean, just the difference in the number of votes should tell people that there were millions of votes manufactured in some fashion back in 2020, multiple millions, maybe up to 15 million even.
It's just unbelievable. I think, I mean, many of us hoped that Mike Pence would, on January 6th, say, okay, folks, the least we can do is, send some of this stuff back to the states, give them 10 days. Was that your hope on that day?
I think that was my hope on that day. It's so complicated. I mean, that would have been a very difficult position for Mr. Pence to take. I understand that. I do think it was warranted. But I think what should have happened is the Supreme Court should have ruled on cases that were pending before it and decided the issue as a matter of law. For example, just last week, they decided that candidates have standing to sue to contest elections. Well, all 4 of my lawsuits in federal courts across the country were dismissed for lack of standing when we represented constitutional electors who another court have held are indeed candidates because they're elected to go be the votes for the actual candidates. So none of our lawsuits should have been dismissed on standing. And one federal judge in Michigan actually sanctioned us $150,000 for having filed the lawsuit.
I was under the impression that the Supreme Court said that, and this is again 4 or 5 years ago, that the Supreme Court ruled that the Texas lawsuit, for example, that they didn't have standing. Am I getting that wrong? Was it not the Supreme Court that said there was that they didn't have standing to bring the suit?
I can't remember, Eric, whether it made it to the Supreme Court with an actual holding by the Supreme Court or whether a lower court held that and the Supreme Court didn't take it. No, it would have had to go directly to the Supreme Court. So maybe they did hold that. I'd have to look back and see. I've forgotten. Some of those I've blocked out.
Yeah. In which case, no, it's just, I mean, it is complicated. And I think, listen, if we want to talk about how it is that evil works, one of the ways that evil works is by being complicated. If something's complicated, many people will say, it's too complicated. I need to move on to something I can understand.